Dynoing your car, especially after doing some mods or seeing a before and after result, can be very expensive or can get expensive if you have to do multiple runs or if you have to come back multiple times. And this is why Virtual Dyno is such a cool piece of software. Well, yes, this does not make a dyno obsolete. The values or the horsepower numbers you will get out of this are just a point of reference. They should not be taken as 100% truth and with a grain of salt, because there are some variances I'm going to get into that make them kind of difficult to judge. But the good thing is that you can really see what modifications improve your power, for example, and that's even on a very or relatively low percentage number. So for example, if you up your boost or your ignition timing, you can see if your car actually gets faster, because your butt-dyno might not tell you everything. First of all, for which ECUs or what kind of cars does this work? Basically, this works for anything that can take a log with a base of time, so a time axis and a RPM axis. This is pretty much the only two things you need to get a log that Virtual Dyno can read. Then the other things you need are the specifications of your car. You will need to know everything that has to do with gearing, with your tire size, with your weight, and also your aerodynamics, so what wind resistance your car has. First of all, we want to start off with a log. I, in my case, have used a Videomic ECU to take logs with Tuner Studio, so we have a few logs here. I'm using, in my case, Megalog Viewer. I've taken a pretty long run. There you go, you can see this is a pretty long run. On the bottom axis there you can see the time. So it is pretty long, and we only need a part throttle or part of this run where we do a pull. So what you need to do is, the best thing to do is go into a gear where you have no wheel spin at all. For me, this is third gear. In second gear, I still experience some wheel spin or a lot of wheel spin sometimes, depending on the ground. Third gear for my car is where I do not experience wheel spin. Then you need to get yourself a straight piece of road with as little road imperfections as possible, because those will influence the power measurement. As when your wheel is leaving the ground or lifting off, the RPM will increase, and therefore the ECU or Virtual Dyno will think that you are actually accelerating faster than you actually are. So this will give false power readings. So you want to search for a stretch of road where you can accelerate in one pull from, I'd say, 2000 RPM to limiter in the gear where you have 100% traction. That's what I have done here. So we are starting here at about 1500 RPM all the way up to about 1000 RPM. As you can see, here is 100% TPS. So I am full throttle this whole way. Of course, because this ECU captures everything, I also have the AFR values here, etc. So this can be quite nice if you want to look at that. But for example, if you use VCDS to log something, you only need a few values, for example, like RPM, time, and also if you want to show that in the dyno graph, you can also log boost or lambda or AFR. To get something that, or to get a file that Virtual Dyno can actually read, you need to have the full version of a Megalog Viewer. In this case, if you're using a Megasquirt or Spkes, for example, ECU, then you can, under File, export loaded log as, then you click on Megalog Viewer ASC2 data log MSL, because Virtual Dyno does not read or does not like the MLG file, so you need to use this one. I already saved it as 5 modified here, and we are going to open this file within Excel, and here we have our current or the log with all the raw data. Now it is important to search for the spot where you are doing your pull. So we have TPS here, so in column F. You also need to delete the first 3 rows so that the Virtual Dyno sees this one as the first one, so the first line, and then you look for TPS and scroll to the point where you are doing your pull. This should be pretty simple or pretty easy to see, because obviously there is going to be a long stretch of 100% TPS. So this and up to here might be it. There you go. So you can delete everything except from these lines. So that's why it also makes sense to just start your log shortly before you do the pull, because otherwise you will have to delete a bunch of lines that you do not need, but otherwise you only need to use these ones. And I have also actually prepared this. So in my case, this looks like that. So we have our TPS here. I have left in a few cells before that, or a few lines before that. And here we are going from 100% from 1600 RPM all the way to limiter down here. And that is our pull. And we save that as a separate file. I have everything else, like if you wanted to include anything into the log as well, you have basically anything here as well. So you want to look at AFR or lambda targets, etc. You have everything that you want to know, but that's not really necessary for Virtual Dyno. So you have this file right here. That's basically everything you need, and you can import that into Virtual Dyno. Now we start Virtual Dyno. We are going, I'm showing you from 0 basically, and then you load your file, pull third gear, and here's already the field where you can input your car. There are a few cars to select, and if you are lucky, your car is already shown here. For example, there are a few Miata options here. For example, if you have one of those are already included, but a lot of cars obviously are not, so you have to add them yourself. And this is where it becomes a bit tricky. You go to File, Car Editor, and then you put in everything you, for example, need. I'm going to load mine right now. I put in, so you can see what I mean. I put in my year of car. That's really not necessary for data, but it's just for your own reference so that you know where you are starting at. Then there is the weight. This is the actual weight of the car without you. So don't really use the weight that is shown in the internet or in your papers, because that's not really accurate. I would actually go ahead and weigh the car, because that's much more accurate and will give you much more accurate power numbers. The more accurate all those things are, the more accurate your power number is going to be. Because I don't really know the weight of my car, I just put 2600 in here. You can change those things later, especially the weight, for example, and the tire dimensions, because obviously those can vary. But for example, I put in 2600 pounds here, and you have to put in your car drag coefficient. That's a bit tricky to find on older cars. In my case, there is no value for my car, so I put in 0.34 because that's the basically closest similar car that there is. The problem here is also that if you, for example, use a body kit or a wing that can change your drag coefficient, then this obviously gets a bit useless and you can't really measure power in a very accurate way. The frontal area is also a thing that has to do with the drag coefficient. So that's the same thing here. Most of the time, if you have the drag coefficient listed, there's also a listing for the specification of frontal area. The tire diameter is also important. Even if you have two tires that are the same size in theory, the tire diameter can be different. For example, I'm using a 195/50/15 Federal 595 RS Pro. That is supposed to be 22.68 inches, The actual tire diameter is 22.8, but if, for example, the tire is worn down a lot, it can be less than that. So it would be best to measure it with a piece of string, for example, wrapped around the tire, and then measure how long that piece of string is. That would be the most accurate way if you want a really accurate measurement. Then we have the transmission options, or rather the gearing selection. Obviously you do not need to fill in every gear, because only the ones where you do runs are necessary to know for Virtual Dyno, so most of the time it's going to be third or fourth. And what's also really important is the final drive ratio, and if you have set up everything correctly, you can click on Save as Custom, and then the car will appear under Custom. Now I can select my car here under Custom, Toyota, Carina. Then I can select which gear I want to use, so third gear in my case. And I have to adjust the weight a bit, since 2600 was on the pretty conservative side, and the results I was getting were kind of weird. So that is what my dyno graph would look like. Well, there is one problem though. You see this bulge right here. If we, for example, look at our smoothing factor, I would always recommend to check out the dyno graph or the dyno once with smoothing 0, because then you can see if there are any irregularities, for example, like here. This is probably something where my wheel skipped or something, or RPM went up 50 RPMs where it shouldn't have. And this is why I have to ignore something like this. So my power would be more like 180 wheel horsepower, not 214. Although even the 180 is, I think, not really true, because that engine is not going to make 180 wheel horsepower, because it just isn't. These 4AG 20 valve engines make 160 horsepower stock at the crank, and with the mild modifications I did, they do make a bit more maybe, but not that much. So take these results you get from Virtual Dyno with a grain of salt. If you put smoothing, for example, to a higher number, you will get a more homogeneous graph, but your values, for example, from the lowest right here to the highest will get a little bit closer, so you might get skewed results, especially if you have like a spike right here. This spike, if you have that in your graph, I would do another log and try again, because the streets where I live are so terrible. There's pretty much no chance that I am able to get a run that is perfect. So I'll have to live with that. But the cool thing is that, for example, if I do modifications to the engine now, so for example, if I reduce timing or if I advance timing, I can see if the horsepower for that exact specification goes up or down, because the measurements that are taken here, or the time that is taken here, can be used for power measurements. That is, given I use the same piece of road I did before, because the incline is also a very important factor. If you are driving down a hill, obviously this is going to read much more horsepower than it would on a straight piece of road. So if you are going to use that as a comparison between mods or something, I would highly suggest that you always test on the same stretch of road, because otherwise you can't really compare one run to another one. There's also a correction factor. For example, this assumes a temperature that is 77 Fahrenheit, I think, and 100 kPa of actual pressure. You can actually activate the SAE correction here. And if you, for example, live in a colder or a warmer climate, you can adjust this here, and this will influence your dyno graph. For example, it was about 50 degrees Fahrenheit where I did the run, so that will decrease my horsepower numbers by about 5 horsepower, because it will normalize that to a ambient temperature that is given in the SAE correction. On the bottom part, you can also see some stuff that you can put in. In my case, I have shown the AFR or air fuel ratio value, and you can put in your boost ratio, boost value, or you can show your boost. Because obviously mine is an NA car, I don't really have boost, so this isn't really working for me, but you can show the AFR through the rev range and show how rich or lean your car is running. You can change that in the options and columns and profiles, and you need to name the AFR column, for example, to the same it is in the Excel file. So if I open the Excel file again, this is the name of the column that I'm using, and this here map is the other name. So if you put in those two here and here, you can add these into this bottom one right here. Time and RPM, if you, for example, don't get a graph or don't get this shown right here, then you might need to select different names for this, because mine is already set to time, RPM, and TPS, like here. You might need to type in different names of the columns that are shown in your Excel file here, but otherwise that's pretty easy. On Dyno, you have a few correction factors, or let's say things that you can change. For example, you can do a correction factor for Dynojet, or just one for Virtual Dyno. So this would show a correction that might be on Virtual Dyno. And you can also again change your smoothing factor here, but you can obviously change this also over here. You can change your units of measurement, obviously. So if I, for example, want PS and Newton meters, and I want do not convert, for example, then I can get some different results here. So I now have a graph that is, for example, because I measure in millibar, then I do not have a line that is completely at the bottom because I'm not making any boost. It's right here at the top because the map value is close to atmospheric. And also here, without the correction factor, the power makes a lot more sense than it did, for example, on the Dynojet conversion or Dynojet graph. Also because this is a Japanese car, they measure in PS, and that might be closer to that. If you put this to 1, the correction factor, 163 PS might also be closer to what the car is actually making. Obviously, at that point, you have to ignore this right here. Now I want to also show you what a dyno looks like that actually works pretty well. This was from a customer of mine that I tuned the car for with a VVT Miata, so a Mark 2.5 that had a Pulsar G25 to 550 on it, also like a Chinese turbo, but that's actually pretty good. And this was from about 3000 RPM to 6700 RPM. And you can see the graph, although we are only at a smoothing factor of 1, we can see that the graph is pretty smooth here. So we didn't have any skips in RPM or something. This is pretty much an ideal graph that you are going to be looking at if you were using Virtual Dyno. I used the Dynojet conversion here, so the 1.09 multiplier, and we came out at about 240 wheel horsepower, which actually is very, very close to what the car would actually make with that setup. As you can see down here, we're starting at about 10 psi and going up to 12. With that big of a turbo, well, kind of, for a big engine it wouldn't be big, but for a 1.8 engine it is pretty big, and tapering to 12 psi because of some boost creep. The 240 to 250 wheel horsepower are usually in the neighborhood of what is common. The timing I used here was pretty conservative, so the horsepower is lower because the car was driven in the US with pump fuel, so that's something you have to keep in mind. AFR was pretty rich, though I wanted to keep the car from knocking, so I was at the limiter using quite a lot of fuel. But that's what, for example, an ideal scenario for Virtual Dyno would look like, and an ideal run basically. And for my European friends, the wheel horsepower would also be about plus 15%, and that would be crank horsepower. So for example, at 250 wheel horsepower, you would be looking at roughly 280 to 290 horsepower at the crank for a rear-wheel drive car. And so this is pretty much also the limit for the Miata engine for the 1.8. This is with stock compression ratio also. That's it from me for the Virtual Dyno showcase. I wish it could take away a bunch of things from this video, and you know how to use Virtual Dyno now, because it is a very powerful tool for tuning if you don't have access to a dyno, or if you don't want to spend a lot of money going to a dyno every time you modify your car. And if you have any questions, let me know down below. Otherwise, I wish you a nice day and goodbye.